Thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's a real pleasure to be here at your lunch and to hear a little bit about the work that you're doing. So perfectionism has this slightly mixed reception when I talk about it, because particularly when I talk to the media, they say, well, isn't it good to be a bit perfectionistic? But what we know is that perfectionism has increased significantly in young people over the last 27 years, and we know that it has toxic effects on their mental health. So I'm going to just spend a few minutes today exploring that with you, and I would hope that when you come out of this and someone says to you, isn't it great that they're such a perfectionist, you can say, well, actually, no. So the quote, you've heard the Winston Churchill quote, and he actually has a lot of quotes about perfectionism. He talked about perfectionism being the enemy of progress. So he's a really interesting guy to look up if you want to know a little about his opinions. But essentially society is in two minds about whether perfectionism is good or whether it's bad. And research helps us to understand, first of all, why we have this mixed sort of opinion about perfectionism, but also what we can do about it. So when we talk about perfectionism, it's typically talking about two different aspects. Now, the bit where people get confused is when we talk about high standards. Okay, so what we see with perfectionism is what we call rigid high standards that keep moving beyond what's really possible. So the example that I give here is a student that goes to university and says, I have to get a high distinction for all my assignments. Okay, I have to. So that becomes very rigid, and as those of us who went through university know, it's just not possible to get a high distinction for everything, no matter how hard you work, because it's not just about the hard work. So rigid high standards can be defined by saying something like, if I do not set the highest standards for myself, I'm likely to end up a second-rate person. Okay, so I think what you can sense from that is that little bit of anxiety and fear, that I will get left behind if I don't keep pursuing these rigid, punishing, high standards. Now, the interesting thing about that is that these rigid high standards are associated with better academic performance, but they don't protect against the negative behaviours that go with that, like procrastination, burnout, and essentially working in unproductive ways, spending a lot of time checking, and which of course leads to the burnout and to anxiety. Now, you'll say to me, well, what is it that you'd like us to do then? Not aim for high standards. Well, the answer to that is no. We actually know that striving to achieve, striving for excellence, is good for your mental health. And of course, that's good news for me. That means I don't have to seek a career change at this point of my life. I can continue to keep striving to achieve and striving for excellence. So I've given you an example of what that sounds like. I have high standards for my performance at work or school. Okay? But you'll notice that it doesn't say I must, I have to, I should. And it doesn't equate achievement with the sort of person I am. Okay, so that's really the clear differential here. And I would not call that perfectionism, I'd call that striving for excellence, which is adaptive and it's healthy. And it's also associated with higher academic performance, but it also protects against the unhelpful behaviours like burnout and anxiety. So it's a much better place to be in if you're actually wanting to achieve over the long term. What comes to me as a psychologist, schools approach me and they say, we've got all these gifted children and they were all working hard, and then suddenly they all decided that they didn't want to do the top subjects as they moved through high school. They all started underperforming. We don't know what's going on. Well, that's your academic burnout. That's the kids who just can't live with the anxiety of not keeping up these relentless high standards and bearing the shame of not being that person that can do that. So it actually starts to undercut performance over the long term. It starts to cripple people from maintaining excellence and progress in the long term. The other part of perfectionism is concern about mistakes. People sort of get that this is harmful all the way around. This is where people continuously feel a discrepancy between what they want to do and what they do. And even when they achieve, they don't take pleasure in it. They just focus on their failures. They judge themselves as being less worthwhile as a person if they're not achieving. They also suspect that everyone around them is being critical about them because they're not achieving, they're not getting the runs on the board. So that's uniformly associated with poor outcome, poor academic performance, and burnout. So let's have a look at the type of perfectionism that I'm talking about. Is unremitting, rigid high standards and concern over mistakes. We know, first of all, that it's associated with elevated levels of depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and suicidality. And this is how it looks. It's about pushing yourself really hard to meet your goals, even when it harms you. So even if you're exhausted, even if you have to socially isolate, even if you have to cut yourself in order to keep going, people will keep doing that because they prize achievement over everything else. Standards are essentially unrealistically high, like the example that I gave before. It's also that you feel a failure as a person if you don't achieve the goals you set. You feel highly anxious about not meeting your standards. You don't take pleasure in achievement. You think, well, if I did it, everyone else could. I have to actually raise my standards. Self-worth is contingent on achievement. When you think about the things that impact the way you feel about yourself as a person, and you can do that now if you think about what makes you feel good about yourself, we will have achievement on that list. But there are other things that are not related to achievement. Your perfectionist is really focused on defining self-worth in terms of achievement. This is also associated with repeatedly checking performance and also often asking other people, how long did it take you to do that? What mark did you get? We've all met those people. There's also a whole lot of other impacts of this type of perfectionism. It impacts psychological well-being. It does increase suicidal ideation and self-harm. It harms academic performance, and we see people who might have survived in high school, but then they get to university, and they're the ones that drop out. Not because they couldn't do the work, but they couldn't stand the pressure of their perfectionistic expectations. It damages self-esteem. It damages social connections. It actually interferes with the pursuit of valued goals, as I think you've gathered from what I've said, because people put too much pressure on themselves and they start to burn out. And it's associated with self-criticism and lower levels of self-compassion. And perfectionists typically believe that they need self-criticism to beat themselves up. They think that's the way to get better performance. And you might say to them, well, would you treat someone else like that? And they say, oh, no, but I'm more deficient. I need harsher handling. I need to criticise to get the best out of me. So we also know that when it's present in the clients that I see, I have an eating disorder treatment centre at Flinders University, it means they're more likely to drop out, less likely to complete the therapy. The other point I wanted to make is that it's relevant to all people. People think it might just be about the gifted kids or the highest socioeconomic status people. That's actually not the case. So there's a study here that was done in Norway with Norwegian adolescents, and it showed that, first of all, the levels of perfectionism were similar across boys and girls. The difference was that the girls tended to be, in terms of the problematic perfectionism, you had more of those. But this is an age group, unfortunately, where we know that girls are ahead of the curve on boys than boys on many things, but also on poorer mental health. This will come to the boys, but a little bit later down the track. And high perfectionism was related to perceived economic well-being, but not parental education levels. So you can have kids who are in a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds, and the reason they might not be achieving is, again, not because they're not capable, but because they've started to cripple themselves with expectations and the fear of not meeting those expectations. We also know that intellectually gifted students display equal levels of perfectionistic concerns compared to non-gifted students. So that is rife in the community. Okay, let's talk about, get a better idea for what striving for excellence is. This healthy concept, this thing that's actually good for mental health and it's good for achievement. So what I've got here is a list to offer a little bit of a contrast to make this a bit clearer. So the perfectionist sets high goals and works hard towards them, but almost perfect is seen as a failure. Black and white thinking. It's absolutely no good. The person who strives for excellence is setting high goals, heading towards them to just sort of go on the journey. What's the best I can be? And the outcomes inform improvement. The perfectionist spots those tiny imperfections in their work, and they pay selective attention to the imperfections, and they ignore accomplishment. The person who strives for achievement takes pride in their accomplishments and tries to be supportive of others. The perfectionist tends to be pushed towards their goals by a fear of not achieving. They're looking at that end, at the destination, and the fear of not getting there is crippling. The person who strives for excellence tends to be pulled towards their goals. They're intrigued by the journey and how to achieve them. They're not hyper-focused on the destination. The perfectionist sets their initial goals out of reach, whereas the person who strives for excellence sets themselves high goals. They enjoy going a little further once the goal is met, but it's little incremental steps each time. It's not this focus on the far target. Perfectionists are concerned about meeting the goal and avoiding failure, that they don't enjoy the process of growing and striving. They find that problematic, whereas those people that strive for excellence enjoy the process of chasing a goal as much, if not more, than the actual reaching of the goal itself. The perfectionist beats themselves up more when their high expectations go unmet, and these negative feelings persist. It's not momentary, it hangs around. The person who strives for excellence bounces back after failure or disappointment, and they get back on the bike much more quickly after a perceived setback. The perfectionist is much more afraid to fail than other people, whereas the person who strives for excellence, well, we don't enjoy failure. I never enjoy it when someone rejects my manuscript, but they usually give good feedback about how to make it better, and it has. The perfectionist takes constructive criticism defensively, whereas the person who strives for excellence sees criticism as a valuable source of information to help improvement. The perfectionist believes they have to be self-critical to get better results. The person that strives for excellence is more likely to exhibit self-compassion and in that way sustain themselves for the long journey. And finally, the perfectionists worry so much about doing something imperfectly that they become immobilized and often fail to do things, whereas the person who strives for excellence is more likely to approach their valued goals. So I'm hoping that sort of helps you understand that difference, and that's why I would say all perfectionism is unhelpful, and whereas striving for achievement, striving for excellence is absolutely fine. Just the last thing I wanted to mention here is that we can actually treat perfectionism. This is one of the treatments that I've developed with some collaborators here in the UK and Australia. It's been around for quite a while. We've had many chances to test it and evaluate it and develop it. What I'm showing you here is just our latest published study. And we called it for this purpose the Focused Minds program. We put it online. It's interactive online modules, 8 modules. We don't call it perfectionism because we have a problem. All our perfectionists say, oh, well, I'm not a perfectionist because I can't do anything perfectly. And it's like, okay, well, let's just call it the, whatever it was, Focused Minds program. Draw them in like flies to the honey, and once they're stuck, then we've got them and they can do the modules. This online module is on our website. It's called overcomingperfectionism.com. Absolutely feel free to visit that, or if you have young people that you're involved with, direct them to the website. We've been very committed to testing things and then making them freely available once we know that they're first of all safe but also effective. So that website has a lot of useful material on there for people. As Frida mentioned, I work within a cognitive behaviour therapy framework, and what we did here is that we rolled out these modules to young people aged 18 to 25 who, in this case, identified as having concerns about their weight. So essentially they were starting a journey towards an eating disorder. They had high levels of disordered eating. And what we saw is after they did the module, compared to a control group that didn't get the modules, we saw a significant drop in disordered eating. This is at the 3-month follow-up. A significant improvement in depression and anxiety and stress. A significant drop in the hate itself, which is that self-criticism, and a significant drop in concern over mistakes, perfectionism. We call our perfectionism treatment a transdiagnostic treatment because it does target across the different mental health issues. So in that way it becomes a flexible tool. You don't have to say this is for depression and that's for anxiety. It can be used across the mental health difficulties that young people experience. We also compared it to a PDF, just giving people modules, which is available on the Centre for Clinical Interventions website, which is an excellent website. Again, a lot of free self-help material. I have to say Australia really punches above their weight with mental health research and is well recognised around the world as doing so. And Centre for Clinical Interventions is an outstanding example of the sort of work that gets done. Now, when they got those modules compared to the control group, they did reduce their disordered eating, their stress and inadequate self, but you can see that the more attractive and interactive intervention, our online module, affected more variables and affected them more, so that people had better improvements doing that. Okay, that's my boasting done. I will now just remind you about the website. If you do want to access that, please feel free. It does contain therapeutic protocols, it has questionnaires, it has links to online treatment modules, it has worksheets, references. We have done these interventions in classrooms, so it has lesson materials. We also are currently working on a study which is funded by Channel 7, teaching parents to deliver it to their children who are 12 years and under. And we also have a comprehensive reference list. So please do check that out. And I'm very happy to take any questions.
Tracey, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I'd like your thoughts on, and this is probably another whole conversation, but where does perfectionism come from? Like, where does it start? What sort of things trigger it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one I can't fully answer. We think there's a bit of a genetic component. So you probably all have met the kids who might be 2 or 3 or 5 years old, and they already like a lot of order. And they like things done just so, and they're a bit intolerant about uncertainty. So that can emerge. And one of the people that I worked with clinically who had anorexia nervosa, she was a perfectionist, and when she went to school there was a rule that you had to wear your hat in the schoolyard during break. But because she followed all or nothing rules, she would wear her hat all the time and got extremely distressed if her parents tried to take it off her when she was going to sleep at the end of the day. Okay, so you can see that happen. We do know that perhaps some parents, not all, can unhelpfully and perhaps unintentionally promote it by focusing on achievement. And we also know that there's been a increase in sort of neoliberalism, which to me simply means a move away from community and a greater focus on individual endeavour and individual achievement, and the importance of just stepping on each other's heads to get a bit above or a bit beyond the next person. And from what I think is happening in the world at the moment, I don't think that's actually going to get any better. So there is a variety of things. The other thing that we, of course, like to blame is social media. And there's a lot of discussion about social media at the moment. We're quite involved in that, but certainly I would say that has offered more and very graphic ways of comparing yourself to others and coming up short and finding things. And it looks like when people post their Bali holidays that they had a fantastic time, but they didn't post the photos when they had their head down the toilet for the first 3 days with the Bali belly. They're just posting the best. So we're getting a slightly unrealistic idea that everyone else out there is having a better life than we are, and they're really not. It's just that we've learned to better sort of edit our lives for public presentation.
Thank you. Hello?
Yep.
Sorry. Peg, I think you pretty much answered my question, but how much do we think that the perfectionism is driven by the social media and people actually seeing, particularly their bodies in your field of expertise, and is that therefore creating a much worse situation than we've seen before? And do you envisage that getting better, particularly with the change in legislation?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. I'll just stick to what I actually know. We have published on the bi-directional associations between using appearance-based social media and body dissatisfaction. And we found, we did an analysis across a number of studies. So we found there was a clear causal direction from consuming appearance-based social media as opposed to just chatting to people on Facebook or something. I don't use social media, I've got no idea what I'm talking about, but anyway, this is an example. So there's a definite relationship that way. There's also going back the other way, that the more body dissatisfied you are, the more likely you are to go to unhelpful social media sites. But there's definitely both directions. It's been the banning of social media. Most of you will be aware that the South Australia is leading in that discussion, and they're partnering with the federal government to introduce a ban in young people who are aged 14 years and under using social media. Now, there's actually diversity of opinion amongst my mental health colleagues, and we've been discussing this. I support the ban. A lot of my colleagues don't. They say that it's a source of connection for young people, and the evidence is not completely robust showing that it causes harm. My argument would be that, well, while we're finding out if it actually causes harm, let's put it on ice, let's put it on hold, and young people will do, I sound like an old fogey, they'll do what I had to do when they wanted to connect. They'll go and talk to people, or they'll ring them up, or they'll do things that involve face-to-face interaction. So maybe that's actually not a bad thing if it leads to that. And let's get the evidence, but let's not wait for more harm to be done until we get this gold-plated evidence. The other thing that people say is, oh, how are you going to police it? And I think, well, if we had that attitude with cigarettes, alcohol, well, we'd say, oh, well, don't even bother. Because we know young people can get hold of cigarettes and alcohol. They have since Adam was a boy. So, if they want to. But what it does, it gives parents the ability to actually gather together, to link together and say, it's not allowed, we are not going to give in. Just because your friend has it, we're not going to, so it empowers parents, I think, to keep their kids a bit safer.
Thanks. I'm trying to get my head around how exactly when I asked this question, but so the description you had about setting standards was about like people setting internally standards for themselves. It didn't speak about external standards that we basically have to fulfill. I mean, I work at a university as you do, kind of like we have role statements, we have promotions with like all these tick boxes and criteria. So there are all these kind of like statements of like, this is what you should do, this is what you should do, this is an A-star journal, etc. So how do you, like, how much is it different between kind of like the focus on the internal standards and how we deal with those, and the focus with external standards? Because there are actual consequences of not making that standard.
Yeah. It's a great question, because the external standards, the external imposition of standards is certainly there. It's there in schools, it's there at universities, and as academics. We're constantly told we should do better. I just think people should mind their own business. But anyway, I think essentially, again, okay, there are standards, there are expectations, but and so that puts the pressure on everybody. And it could send us all crazy if we were sort of trying to chase that. This is where it's really important to find our own way of responding in a way that's helpful, to think about which of the standards we feel we want to pursue, we can't pursue them all, and which are most important to us. How can we support each other in pursuing that? The perfectionist often just tries to forge on ahead. And we know as researchers we work better in collaboration and in teams. And how do you respond? Do you not take it personally? Do you not see it as an aspect of your identity? So when that reviewer tells me this is a recent quote, this person clearly doesn't understand the scientific endeavour. I don't take it personally. Much. I just think, well, that person's got a problem. So, there's ways of actually, how do we respond? And again, sometimes just getting support to help you find that place from which you respond to the pressures is a really wise thing to do.
Thank you. My question really relates to age. And it seems to me that a lot of the research seems to be at a younger age. And the question really is there some transition in age and the impact on perfectionism? Or do people grow up and continue the same way? And it seems to me that the transition is something that's quite important. And when we start to talk about social media and that, you can start to see, and that's a very clear thing that's happening in society now, that none of us have probably been experienced in. You can see from your grandchildren and children, and the transition that goes into parents, etc., that age does have some serious impact on the behaviour of people.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, from a perfectionist, are you looking at that in terms of how does that transition from a young age to an older age, and is the patterns consistent?
It's a great question, and I'm starting to have a few research ideas flash through my mind, which I'm trying to suppress because I don't have time. But I think certainly young people are under much more pressure around perfectionism. But of course we all knew the perfectionists when we were kids going through school, the kids that couldn't sit their exams because they were too anxious about failing. And unless they actually worked on that or got some sort of help, they would continue into older age. But the other thing that older age does bring, and this is universally observed, is that older people have higher levels of life satisfaction by the time they get to about 70. We move into a sort of a more Zen appreciation of life, they tell me. So, so there's also that moderating effect where you start to be more accepting and also more focused. Now we've got all the pressures behind us a bit about connecting and social relationships and who are we and how do we relate to the world.
I suppose as a secondary thing I would like to ask is that having been involved in various aspects of life, including high levels of sport, I've come across more perfectionism in sporting areas than I have in the academic areas because of my background in that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
It is amazing to see how some people can train on one particular skill set for 3 hours a day, and that's important to them. Does that come into any of your research?
We use a lot of examples of athletes in our perfectionism work because you can, of course, overtrain, you can damage yourself. Or we know there's quite a few Olympians that have achieved, but at a price to their mental health. Whether it be depression or eating disorders or other things. And so my interest is in helping people to achieve without that damage. Thank you.